So I actually saw the Vince McMahon documentary, and pardon my hair, I was laying down earlier. But yeah, I saw the Vince McMahon documentary, and honestly, it's for if you're not a fan of professional wrestling, or you actually did, or if you didn't care that if you're not a fan of professional wrestling, this stuff would be kind of a shock to you. But for everybody else who are fans of, it's just basically a reiteration of stuff we all heard before. Like, I mean, some of it made sense in context, but it wasn't anything shocking or eye opening for most of us because to put this in perspective, there's stuff about Vince McMahon that wrestling fans know about that wasn't put into that documentary. That makes sense. And but with that being said, it's still cool to see Vince McMahon actually talk about himself or bring stuff up in his own perspective. You know what I mean? I didn't know that Vince and Brett actually came for blows. Okay, I gotta straighten this out. Hold on, I'm gonna do something with this. I'm gonna do something with this. Okay. Like, it is a pretty fair. Like, I didn't know that Vince and Brett came to blows after the Montreal screw job. You know what I mean? So, I always was told that, Vince went over there, basically said, you know what, you get one good shot and then you got to go. And Brett just and left. That's all I always assumed. But, and I believe Brett. But yeah, though, I did see the Vince McMahon documentary, and I honestly feel like we should talk more about the territories, that Vince actually took down, or rather poached, so to speak, because we don't talk enough about like in what NWA was and what the territories was before Vince got into power. We don't talk about the relevance of those things. It's like, in order for him to got to where he is, these other things had to happen. We don't talk about the time before Vince or the time before WWE. And I find that to just be a little messed up because it wasn't just, in the beginning there was Vince McMahon. I also don't think that there's a lot of, like, depending on who you talk to, what Vince McMahon did was a genius move, which I don't think it was. I don't think that what Vince McMahon did was genius or smart. I just think he just had enough money to, like, if there's one thing I hate, is this idea that rich people are somehow pushed as smarter or more daring or whatever, because at the end of the day, they just have money to make mistakes. To put this in perspective, Vince McMahon is like, the reason why WWE has so much longevity is ultimately because Vince is rich. The same criticism that wrestling fans have for AEW now. It's just the ultimate. It's like, if the lesson that I learned from the Vince McMahon documentary is you can do whatever you want as long as you are rich. Bar none. If you're rich, you can do whatever you want. At least until you can't anymore. But before then, go out. And that's the thing about Vince McMahon that, like, and the problem is that, like, there's more of I feel like there shouldn't really be a documentary about Vince as much as it should be a documentary about WWE in general, because we tend to forget that Vince wasn't the only bad apple in WWE. There was there was a time in WWE and professional wrestling in general where, like, there's a lot of wrestlers who could tell us such crazy things that happened in WWE who are no longer with us. You see what I'm saying? But there are people who are still lingering from that era, from that generation of wrestling, that we should, like, be talking to about that time frame because it's important. But yeah, like, the Vince documentary, it didn't turn my head. It didn't surprise me. It didn't shock me. It did nothing. It just, I saw the Vince documentary, and the first thing that went through my head is, I mean, well, yeah, he's a rich old guy, rich elderly guy. Because, and I like to think that we're all smart enough to know that rich dudes are evil, right? We know this now. But yeah, but it is a crazy. It was definitely it was a slightly satisfying. It was slightly satisfying to see, Vince do his own personal take on certain things, and it's also good. It's also satisfying to see Hogan actually like admit that he tried to stop the unionizing process, because it was like, like for everything that we see that Hogan is, and for every reason we have to dislike Hulk Hogan now, to see him hold himself accountable for something like that, I mean, it's growth, regardless of how you feel about him. And I say this as a person who's not a big fan of Hogan. You know what I mean? Hogan got on camera in front of a group of people and said, "I screwed up. I did the thing. I messed it up. It was me." You know what I'm saying? It's wild. It's wild to see that. Another thing that I thought was kind of, but yeah, it's just like I kind of, part of me don't really, the most odd one out in that whole situation was Tony Atlas. I didn't necessarily like Tony Atlas. It's like, because outside of, I mean, like his input about the situation, it definitely comes off as, it definitely comes off as relevant, but I just can't see past him. If you just Google Tony Atlas, I don't even want to refer to the weird things that guy is into, but it's like when I see him, I can't unthink of the weird things that he's involved in otherwise. Like, you know what I'm saying? It is also kind of cool to see Undertaker, like it's always good to see Undertaker talk about the old days of wrestling, because he was around for that era. He was around for that time frame, and he was fairly young himself when he got in, but he got in around a time when was he around for I don't think he was around for the first Mania. I don't know when his Mania debut was, but the fact of the matter is that like it's crazy how, it's also crazy, like looking back, it's crazy how like WrestleMania, the very first WrestleMania was almost 40 years ago, right? Almost 40 years ago. It really put into perspective the time frame. To put this in perspective, Hulk Hogan main evented the first WrestleMania. Okay? The very first WrestleMania. And he's still alive. And he's still alive and kicking long enough to actually talk about it. You see what I'm saying? Like, that's important. There's a WrestleMania, WrestleMania 30 was some years ago. And, like, the guy who highlighted the first one is alive long enough to actually talk about this one. It's just like, it really kind of makes it kind of puts it all in perspective, the time frame that is involved in this thing, like time, it's like, it's such a long time ago. And if you're like, I think I was born around the time of the first Mania. I'm not sure, but I do remember being a kid and when Andre the Giant died, that was like a big deal. Like, that was I remember being a kid, and like when he died, it was like people were still talking about, like people were talking about it, like I want to say a year later, like he just died. So that was something that sort of just surprised me. But yeah, like the Vince McMahon documentary, like if I had to, like if you're not a wrestling fan and sort of slightly interested in professional wrestling, it would definitely like open your eyes to what kind of atmosphere pro wrestling had back in those times in comparison to what it is now. You know what I'm saying? Shout out to Chris Nowinski for like making CTE a relevant issue, because Lord knows concussions are bad, and it's weird that it took a scientific study to prove that. But it's just like, it's cool. It's really cool to just kind of see how that it's just really cool to see an evolution of professional wrestling from what it was to what it is. You know what I'm saying? And it's wild. But like now, part of me is compelled to see a WWE documentary, like like featuring this big, featuring all of the wrestlers, or at least most of the wrestlers that they can get, kind of just taking their own shot at what professional wrestling was. Like, there's a series of shoot interviews, just all kind of compiled into like a series where people can just, they ask questions and they talk about things. I feel like that would be kind of cool to see. Just like all of those interviews just compiled together. Like instead of not just a WWE documentary, just a pro wrestling documentary. That's pro wrestling is now a part of American culture, and I feel like we owe it to ourselves to understand it a little bit more now. But that's about it, though. Y'all be easy.